So The Holdovers is Alexander Payne's most recent directorial effort. The last movie he made before this was called Downsizing. It had Matt Damon. I didn't watch it. I've only ever heard bad things about this movie, which actually makes me curious to see it because I love this filmmaker. I love Sideways, great movie, really phenomenal script, great directing, excellent performances. It's a good movie, you know? What? I like it. I like the movie. Paul Giamatti has been a really underrated actor for years. I mean, I guess in terms of underrated actors, he's been more appreciated than most, but he still belongs in that category, you know? Like, he's still not a star. He's in this movie as well. He's kind of in a big role, actually, and it's been great seeing him get the amount of attention he's been getting for this role. He really is amazing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's track back. Anyway, yeah, The Holdovers, new movie, Alexander Payne directed. What's it about? It's about an old, grumpy, boarding school history teacher type guy named Mr. Hunnam.
Philistines. Lazy, vulgar, answered little Philistines.
A troubled teenage boy named Angus Tully, and an African-American cook named Rose, who recently lost her son in Vietnam, and how they basically get stuck holding over together at Barton Academy during the Christmas break. At first, tension is obviously pretty high. Angus is a troubled kid who doesn't want to be there at all. He's basically been left behind by his mom. Mr. Hunnam clearly has passion for his job, but not for people. And Rose is obviously in a lot of grief since her son, you know, got killed in the Vietnam War. But as time goes on, things ease up, they start to understand each other, and Mr. Hunnam and Angus form a bond. That sounds really familiar and standard, and the movie has been getting criticism for that. I'm looking at you, YMS. But regardless of how familiar it sounds, in my opinion, this movie is great. It has a lot of humor, drama, angst, and it has a lot of relatable moments that really hit home. I love it. But something interesting has happened with the reception of this movie. It's clearly a drama with comedic elements in it, but a lot of people have been describing it as comfortable, like a comfort movie. The reason this is weird is that is not what Alexander Payne intended. I don't think it's something he ever intends with his movies, and he's been vocal about this fact. How did a seasoned filmmaker who's consistently delivered cynical, somewhat depressing character dramas come out with a movie that people are describing as sentimental and cozy? How did that happen? Did he do something wrong, or did he do something right? Let's dive into it. It wouldn't be entirely inaccurate to say that Alexander Payne makes sentimental movies, but generally speaking, that sentiment is buried in cynicism and uncertainty. By the time the credits roll, it's not easy to imagine the characters are going to turn out okay. It's not like it's a tragedy or something. You don't think they're gonna die. But things are left open-ended, basically. The movie Sideways is a great example of this. At the beginning of that movie, the lead character, Miles, is a really depressed, pathetic, unpublished novelist who hasn't gotten over his divorce. And by the end of the movie, he's still a depressed, unpublished novelist who isn't over his divorce. There's a little bit of hope for him. The last shot of the movie is him trying to talk to the character Maya, a woman he fell in love with but ended up hurting because it's a movie. The movie cuts right to black before we can see what happens. That's where Sideways chooses to leave its audience, uncertain and unsatisfied. It's a very realistic reflection on how life tends to work. Most of Alexander Payne's movies play out like that. They aren't downers, but they aren't uppers either. They're real. The Holdovers is still real, and it still leaves with an open-ended conclusion. But unlike Sideways, I don't feel like the characters are doomed to keep on making the same mistakes. I'm left feeling like progress has been made.
So, what happened? First things first, Payne did not write the script for this movie. Usually, Payne co-writes his movies with Jim Taylor. This is the case for Sideways, Election, About Schmidt, basically his best stuff. But that's not the case for The Holdovers. He had nothing to do with this movie's screenplay. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but he was detached enough to not get any screenwriting credit. All of that went to David Hemmingson. David Hemmingson has been in the industry for a while, but he has never written a feature film. Payne discovered a pilot David Hemmingson had written years ago, based on his experiences going to boarding school when he was young, and commissioned him to write the screenplay for The Holdovers. I actually think this is really interesting because the entire time time I was watching this movie, I assumed that Alexander Payne had written it, with Jim Taylor or somebody else. And my assumption blinded me from the fact that there are clear signs that this was written by another person. Hemmingson did an amazing job on this screenplay. That's why he's up for one of those Oscars, you know, one of those. But no matter how hard he might have tried, Hemmingson can't write like Alexander Payne. And Payne could never write like David Hemmingson. It's just not possible. Hemmingson put a lot of himself into this screenplay. Like I said before, it's greatly influenced by his own time spent at boarding school when he was young.
It's very personal to me. It's kind of a memory play because a lot of it's grounded in my relationship with my mom and my uncle and my dad to some extent, but it's sort of like I was kind of mining those feelings that I had in that era, that period of my life, you know.
Now, I'm sure Alexander Payne puts a lot of himself into his own screenplays as well. Kind of impossible to write something and not put some of yourself into what you're writing. But at the end of the day, I think Alexander Payne is a much harder person than David Hemmingson. That's not how I want to phrase it. I'm going to rephrase that. I think he's a less optimistic writer. He's more harsh. David Hemmingson, to me, comes off as a lot softer. The sentimentality is more clear. The scenes of showing people being together and connecting and being happy in their lives have a greater emphasis placed on them than the scenes of people being sad, depressed, self-destructive, and more, oh, like, damn, that's rough. More depressing, basically. Those scenes are certainly still there, but they aren't at the forefront as much. Whether Alexander Payne was aware of this when he approved the script or he wasn't, it's very noticeable when you're watching the movie, and I think it's had a really big impact on how people feel towards the movie. Now let's return to the ending of Sideways and compare it to the ending of The Holdovers. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but again, I just want to emphasize, Sideways leaves us hanging. It cuts to black before we can really see what happens, before we really get any resolution to the characters and their relationships with each other. It's very, very open-ended. The Holdovers, at least on paper, also seems open-ended. I'm going to go into spoilers here. Mr. Hunnam takes the blame for something that is completely Angus's fault, resulting in him being fired and having to leave the school, and Angus getting to stay in the school and not go to military school. School. I said school a lot, whatever. But yeah, so we don't really know what's going to happen to Mr. Hunnam, and we don't really know what's going to happen to Angus. We don't know if either of them are going to get their shit together, but the movie doesn't just cut to black after Mr. Hunnam gets fired. Mr. Hunnam and Angus have one final conversation where they look at each other and say, hey, you got this. You can do it. Do we know that that statement is actually true? No. But it's clear that the characters believe that it's true, and it's clear that the time that these characters spent with each other had an influence on their lives. They're not going to keep on making the same mistakes. The final shot of this movie is Mr. Hunnam driving off in his car to Greece or Athens, or I don't know, wherever the weirdo wants to go. And sure, we don't know what's going to happen with him, Angus, or even Mary. But that final conversation makes us feel like there's a good chance they're going to be okay. They still have struggles, but they seem more equipped to handle them, and they feel better about them, and as a result, we the audience feel better about our struggles and our lives. I'm not trying to say this is the only reason The Holdovers feels like a comfort movie. You can point to a lot of things. The soundtrack, the film grain aesthetic, the fact that it looks like a 70s movie, so it's kind of nostalgic in that way, the heartwarming scenes, the relatable characters. But at the end of the day, I think it really does boil down to the screenplay, and how the screenplay leaves us with an ending that implies that this relationship, and therefore our relationships, mean something.
Let me be.